Emma, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Jason. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be on this side of things.
Such a pleasure. I loved your book and such an important message. So let's start with the why. Why the book?
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, I think this book is a culmination of a lot of the work that I've been doing at MBG for the past like 7 years now, which is crazy to say. Over the years of interviewing folks about, the intersection of climate and health, I've had the honor of, speaking with a lot of really incredible thought leaders in sustainability. And, I found that oftentimes when I ask them about their initial inspiration to get involved in the work that they do, a lot of them can point to an experience that they had in nature, or maybe an experience that they had in nature with their children that sort of inspired them to, take action to protect this planet. So I thought it was, I've always been intrigued by the idea of putting out a resource that helps people get outside more and then use that sort of connection that they formed with nature as almost like a catalyst for their environmental action. So that was definitely part of it. And then I just think I've always been interested in the research on, the human health benefits of getting outside, just because I know it's something so many of us feel intuitively, but I always find it fascinating to read about the science behind it too.
I love it. Mindbodygreen, one word, not three, all connected.
Yes.
And so the subtitle is The New Science of How Nature Landscapes Restore Us. So at the highest level, how does nature restore us?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I think that there's so much that sort of goes into a nature experience. Part of it is, nature encourages us, I think, to move more. Folks who tend to live closer to parks also tend to be more active and have more opportunity to sort of get the body moving. So that's obviously a very healthy thing to do. But, I think what I was really interested in and what I sort of focused the book on was just the sort of cognitive benefits of getting outdoors. And there's a lot of research to show that when we, have an experience outside, we tend to return, more less cognitively fatigued. We maybe will, perform better on things like memory tests, and we're just a bit sharper mentally. So I think that's part of it. And then there's also the emotional, aspect of it. And study after study has shown us that people who tend to spend more time outdoors tend to report less stress, less depression, less anxiety. And in the process of calming us down, I think nature has real tangible benefits on our health. I don't have to tell you just how dangerous stress can be, and it's something we write about a lot on My Body Green. But so I think seeing nature as sort of a, I don't want to call nature a tool, but as just another thing that we can sort of interact with in order to bring down our stress for the sake of.
I agree with everything you said. And what I found so fascinating about the book and how you approached it, it was a couple things. One, your focus on different landscapes. And then two, this section of the book, you dive into the evolutionary and cultural theories. And so, can you spend a moment there?
Yeah, totally. So I'll go over the cultural and evolutionary first. So there are two sort of main theories as to why getting out in nature can do things like reduce stress and improve our sort of cognitive abilities. One of them is called the attention restoration theory. And this is focused more on the sort of cognitive side of things. And it essentially says that, the way that we've adapted our lives and sort of our culture, our cultural practices, a lot of our days pretty cognitively draining. When we spend a lot of time on email or just are in meetings all day, our brains really have to focus on all those sort of different points, and getting outdoors into a certain type of landscape that, we don't perceive as being too full or threatening sort of gives our minds a chance to relax. And the researchers who came up with this refer to it as, nature gives us a lot of opportunity for what they call soft fascination. So if you think about viewing a beautiful sunset, for example, like you're attuned to that and your mind is paying attention to that, but it's not draining. It's a opportunity for you to just be, I guess, at ease, and it sort of wipes the mind clean, and so that's one side of things. And then the other theory that is a bit more evolutionary in perspective is called the stress reduction theory. And it basically just says that, humans evolved in nature, and we sort of intuitively know when a natural environment has the resources that we need for survival. So when we get out into a beautiful landscape and we can have this expansive view of, birds and water sources and all this, we feel safe, and we feel at ease. So those are sort of the two.
And you mentioned landscapes. Why the focus on different landscapes specifically in the book?
Yeah, so I think, part of it was I just thought it'd be an interesting way to organize a book. It was we hear a lot about things like the benefits of forest bathing. We're increasingly hearing a lot more about the benefits of blue space, so oceans and coasts. But I was curious if there is research on those sort of other places that we tend to get outside. I also just think people we almost tend to like self-identify with certain landscapes. People will say like, "Oh, I'm a beach person" or "I'm a mountain person," and we take great pride and comfort in that. So I was sort of curious to share, maybe do some research on why that is, why we feel more comfortable in certain landscapes than others. I thought that presenting it that way would sort of get people excited about their own landscape and then maybe new landscapes they hadn't really considered.
It makes total sense. And in terms of landscapes, you reference some really interesting science. One of the first ones I'll call out is a study at the University of Exeter Medical School that found those who live on England's coast tend to be happier than those who lived inland. You also reference studies in Ireland and Japan, essentially coming to the same conclusion. So, what is it about the ocean specifically that seems to work wonders for our mental health?
Yeah, so the ocean is really interesting. I mean, I think in my very informal surveys of friends and family about their favorite landscape, this is one that probably comes up the most for people. And, I think a lot of us feel a certain affinity to the coast. And that study out of Exeter, so there's actually a lot of really fascinating blue space research going on in the UK. And that was, one of the larger ones. It basically just found that folks who live within, I believe it was 5 kilometers of the coast tend to report better mood, less, instances of depression, and that was after, adjusting for things like income. So, there's clearly something going on here. And I think it's multiple things. You think about going to the beach, and there's obviously that opportunity to be active and, also just lounge and take in that all important vitamin D. But, I think there is, sort of that need to get moving when you're on the coast. And I also think about just the sounds of the waves can be incredibly restorative for people. And also just the pattern of the water. I think it really lends itself to, again, that idea of soft fascination. You can just look at those sort of waves and, just sort of train your brain to that, slow, calming lap of waves. So I think those are sort of some reasons that people feel pulled to the coast.
And what's interesting too is it's water in general. You talk about rivers, streams. What was the most compelling science you came across on water in general? I hear you, oceans seem to be number one for all the reasons you just mentioned, but just there's something about water.
Yeah, there definitely is. I mean, it's interesting because I actually remember one of my first interviews that I did for the book was on this researcher by the last name of McCarran, and his research was called Mappiness, which is sort of a fun name. But essentially, he would send folks out with an iPhone app and ping them at different times of the day to ask them what they were doing, how they felt, and what environment they were in. And he found that most often people felt restored and relaxed in an area that had both blue space and green space. So as opposed to, they felt the least relaxed indoors, but the most sort of sense of ease where those sort of two landscapes met, which I think is sort of an interesting idea and a vote in rivers favor. I think rivers sort of give us the opportunity to see multiple different sorts of landscapes, meet each other and coalesce. And I think, that is something that we feel innately drawn to as people.
So in terms of water, next time we're near a body of water, whether it's an ocean, a stream, a bay, even a large puddle, are there any practices we should incorporate to really make sure we're realizing all the health benefits?
Totally. So I think just looking at it is, it seems to be very beneficial. There's a few smaller studies that have been done across the world that essentially found that people who have views of water tend to rate them as more restorative than views of other natural landscapes. So I think just taking a moment to just look at sort of the patterns of the waves can be super beneficial. This is one that I've incorporated into my life here in Brooklyn. I have a view of the East River outside of my window, and whenever I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed or just like I need a break, I try and fight the urge to like reach for my phone and just walk to the river instead and then just look out onto that view and sort of, let my mind tune to that wave pattern. And I find that doing that for just a minute can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. If someone does have a bit more time to devote, I think meditating outdoors and close to the water can be super great. Another really fascinating body of research out of Sweden found that folks who go through meditation programs outdoors versus indoors actually tend to have a higher completion rate from the
Wow.
program, which is super, super cool. And it just this idea that as long as you're not meditating in a super noisy setting, like I don't know if I would necessarily meditate on like Fifth Avenue or something, but just sort of those nature sounds can, sort of look inward. So I would say, yeah, heading out to the water and maybe doing a sit spot meditation. So close your eyes for a moment, open them, and then start to sort of gradually take in more and more of the landscape and, expand the eye outward to sort of take in the scene and take in, the sights and the sounds and to sort of attune to that place.
It's interesting on a personal level. I track everything, and I've noticed whenever I am by the beach, my heart rate variability is at its highest, which is a good thing. I'm also not working as much, so that probably contributes as well. But there is just something magical about being near the ocean. In terms of the magic of nature, let's go inland, mountains. You reference moments of awe, and specifically a professor, Melanie Rudd at the University of Houston, who studied quote unquote awe experiences, which I found to be fascinating. So, what did Professor Rudd find?
Yeah. So, I mean, awe is just a super interesting emotion. I think a lot of us can, recall a time when we got to the top of a mountain or reached some sort of expansive vista and, our jaw dropped. We got goosebumps. That's sort of, those are telltale signs of really having an awe experience. And one thing that's really unique about awe, the way that researchers define it is essentially, it's the emotion that comes to us when we encounter perceived vastness. So essentially, it's an emotion that makes us feel small. So it makes sense that it happens, tends to happen a lot in nature, but things like beautiful music or, really resonant art can also lead to inspiring, awesome moments. So Melanie's work was super cool. I think my favorite study of hers was it was done in Switzerland, and she set it up so that she had researchers at the bottom of the mountain to talk to folks before they went on their hike, and then at the top of the mountain after they had had that experience of seeing the view. And at first, she asked them to fill out a survey that asked them questions about their mood, if they felt sort of more about their awe experience, but also about their perception of time and how much time they thought that they had, because she sort of suspected might alter time perception. And so that was the first part of the experiment. And then when people filled that out, they sort of thought, it was over. And they were then told that they could take a trail mix as a thank you for participating. And they had the option to either make their own trail mix or take the trail mix that had been pre-made. And what they found was that those at the bottom of the hike were less likely or were likely to report that they felt strapped for time. And they were also more likely to take the pre-made trail mix. So essentially, this finding is sort of, it affirms this idea that awe can make us feel like we have more time. It makes us, sort of more puts things into perspective, so to speak. And it also makes us, I think, more creative, is what researchers sort of suspect. If we don't feel like we're rushed or we're, so consumed with our own sort of like schedules, we have more time to open ourselves up to be creative and to try new things. So I thought that was a cool little study.
It is, and in terms of studies, I feel like forest bathing, it has to be at the top of the list, seems to be everywhere. Trees, the forest, so much great science out there. I'm curious in terms of the science, does anything stand out to you in terms of being the most compelling?
Yeah, so forest bathing is super, I think, unique in the sense though of that research is being spearheaded by MDs as opposed to, one of the blue space and green space research here in the States and the UK is by more like environmental psychologists. So forest bathing, I thought the most sort of fascinating part of it was just this idea that, okay, so for those who are unfamiliar and are picturing like actually going out into a forest in a bathtub or something, forest bathing is the English translation of a practice called shirin yoku, which originated in Japan. And it's essentially taking a walk through a forest, but really engaging all of your senses as you do it. So really quote unquote, bathing in your surroundings. And those medical doctors are finding that after, taking a trip into a forest while employing some of these mindful practices, people actually tend to come back with increased immune like sort of health. So one, marker in particular that they have been looking at was the activity of NK cells, which are sort of a first line of defense in the immune system. And they found that after a 3-day forest bathing trip, people tended to have increased NK cell count and activity. And interestingly enough, that increase actually stayed for a 30-day follow-up. So I know
Wow.
you mentioned it's when we get outside, oftentimes we're leaving work behind. So that sort of, might have something to do with it. But I thought that 30-day follow-up was really showing that it's more than that. And it's something that really stays with us.
And something else I thought was quite fascinating you reference in the book on forest bathing, high fractal and low fractal stimuli. Can you talk about what are they?
Yeah. Yeah. So this was another very interesting body of research that a fractal is essentially it's a pattern that continues, but it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So you can think about something like a tree branch. You can think about a head of broccoli. Snowflakes are fractals. So these patterns are present in a lot of nature, but trees in particular are really great, are a great example. And there is some work to suggest that one study in particular that I referenced that essentially had a group of students look at an image that had a high fractal frequency. So, a lot of different repeating patterns in one image versus low fractal frequency. They found that after looking at the high fractal one, students were actually better able to complete a puzzle. Even though that was a more perhaps mentally stimulating image, there's some reason to believe that we almost feel comfortable in the presence of fractals and they're just very readable to us as humans. And there's some theories that humans are actually fluent in fractals and that there are a lot of fractals in the human body as well. So we might somehow, feel a certain resonance with that pattern. So that's another sort of, reason that getting into the woods in particular might evoke something different in you. I think another thing is just the smell of the trees is super distinct. And another really fascinating body of research in forest bathing is this idea that when trees give off these things called phytoncides, and essentially what gives them their great smell, and it's a type of essential oil. And they've done research to sort of isolate those smells, and it shows that after we smell them, we actually do tend to have an increased heart rate variability. So again, it's the calming, look of the branches, the calming smell of the leaves. All these things can sort of combine into that sort of nature experience. So super cool.
So hearing you speak, it sounds like when we're doing our walk in a walk in the woods or amongst the trees, you really got to soak everything in using all of your senses to make it count.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great reminder, just for anyone as they go about their day to day. I'm certainly guilty of this, but I'll head outside and I'll, be on the phone or I'll be listening to something. And it's like I'm not even really there. I don't necessarily pay attention to what's going on around me. But I think just the simple act of bringing that awareness to it can really change the experience for the better.
And so on that note, you and I both live in New York. We live in a city. Lots of our listeners live in cities. And sometimes you live in a city, you don't have easy access to oceans, mountains, rivers, or forests. And maybe we have access to a lone tree on a block near us in our neighborhood. And so with that said, what did you find when you looked at studies that looked at cities?
Yeah. So, I mean, this was obviously a chapter that had a lot of importance to me as a city dweller. Starting to write this book, I started writing it right when COVID hit, and I had really grand plans to go and explore these different landscapes. And I thought I'd be able to do a lot of travel. Obviously, that didn't happen. So, speaking to researchers and learning that we can have these really restorative, incredible nature experiences within city limits it was very reassuring to me. I think a great example of this was there's a body of sort of larger scale research that essentially pairs residential address data, so information about where people live, and then satellite imagery to show how green or not green their surrounding neighborhood is. And that research has found that, people who live in areas that have more access to greenery tend to report they've lower incidence of cardiovascular disease. They tend to be less likely to get diabetes. As I mentioned before, they tend to be more active. And then there's also just a decreased mortality risk. Like people, they tend to live longer if you live close to green space. So, city dwellers might hear that and think like, well, shoot, I don't have any of that. I'm screwed. But in talking to the people who have done that research, they really hammer home the idea that it's not necessarily access to a grand expansive park that seems to have the, the highest associations. It's really the green space that's right outside of your front door, and street trees totally count. They can get picked up in that satellite imagery. So I think it's more just a matter of ensuring that our cities do have some, access to green everywhere, and really spreading that versus just focusing in on like one park is really essential. And I think it's a real, public health. It's a boon to public health.
On that note, most city dwellers, not most city dwellers, this city dweller loves houseplants. We have so many houseplants in our apartment. We've got houseplants in our office. And there was actually a study done, you referenced in the book. So there's actually a horticultural therapist at NYU. And I read that. I was like, okay, that's a thing. And he did a study on houseplants. So let's talk about the benefits of houseplants because I love houseplants.
Yeah, I mean, me too, honestly. They're all around me. But yeah, and so this guy Matthew Rachowski, might have butchered his last name, but he is a horticultural therapist at NYU, which I agree is super unique and fun. But essentially his job is to, go from room to room throughout the hospital and, ask patients about the sorts of plants or flowers that they enjoy. He sources them for them and then brings them to their rooms, helps them plant them, get them set up in a nice spot, and then just, sort of help them, engage with those plants and just to sort of use them as a way to get through that like very stark hospital stay. So his research is interesting. He did a study a few years ago on it was a cohort of about 100 patients who were recovering from a cardiac event. And he essentially found that the patients who underwent his horticultural therapy program tended to report a better mood and also a lower heart rate after their sessions than those who did, more traditional therapy. So I think that is exciting for people like us who love plants because it shows that, there might actually be some sort of, really, restorative sort of benefits to keeping them in our home. I remember when I did the Zoom with Matthew, his home was full of houseplants. So I think that's a great endorsement just for, the power of bringing the outdoors in.
I love it. I'm a huge fan. Another study I thought was quite interesting. You mentioned the conservationist biologist, or excuse me, the conservation biologist, Richard Fuller in the book. And he talks about nature's psychological benefits. What were some of the biggest takeaways for you in researching Fuller?
Yeah, so Fuller was interesting. I think another sort of thing that drew me to this topic was, we've touched on a lot of them already, but just the sort of variation of people who are doing this research. Fuller is a biologist. We've touched on mathematicians doing the fractal research. Like this is really a cross-disciplinary field that, a lot of people are sort of chiming in with their perspective. But Fuller has done some work to sort of show that when we get out into more biodiverse areas of nature with more plant and animal life, we actually rate them as being more restorative than those that have less biodiversity. And I think the interesting thing about that work is just that people don't necessarily they aren't able to identify that they're in an area of high biodiversity. But again, it's that sort of innate knowing of I am in a place that, has all of this life. And there's some reason to believe that that is restorative in itself. Again, city dwellers might be thinking, oh no, there's nothing to see here. But I had a fascinating conversation with a naturalist the other week, and she was telling me that of the 20 most common species found in the US, 19 of them we have in New York City. So,
Wow.
it's here. It's just a matter of sort of attuning to it.
What are we missing?
I forget. I asked her. I think it was a bird. It was a certain type of bird that only exists in like more tropical areas.
That's funny. I'll take 19 out of 20. So I love the book, and the research is just so compelling, and there's so much research. I'm curious, of all the studies, of all the conversations, what stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to choose just one, and I'll go with a conversation that I had recently just because it's at the top of my mind, but it was with an epidemiologist at Harvard, and he was behind some of that more mapping data, so, pairing residential addresses with health markers, and he essentially found that when he made the finding that having more access to green space was associated with lower mortality, he figured that that would be, a result of the decreased cardiac events or things of that nature. But he actually found that mental health was one of the most significant pathways to that. So just he said up to like 30% of the patients who had the lower mortality, and that was sort of the cause of it. So I think that's just such, a clear point that, mental health is so incredibly important, and it's not something that is just like a nice to have. It's really a necessary to have. And, nature is really a place that we can go to improve it.
Agreed. As we chatted about when we first started, you've been with us for 7 years, which is amazing, and we've come so far, and the world has changed so much in many good ways, and in some ways not so good, but we're optimists here. With that said, in terms of, your beat, the sustainability beat, what's interesting to you right now in 2022? Like, what are you watching? Where do you think the science is going? What what are you excited about?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's so interesting to just think back on the last 7 years. And, when I first started at MBG, I feel like sustainability was just not nearly in the conversation as much as it is today. And I think a lot of that, has to do with, people waking up to what the science is telling us. So, in that sense, I've never been more hopeful, just because I feel like my inbox is constantly flooded with companies who have initiatives to, reduce their impact. It's flooded with real thought leaders in the space who are starting their own campaigns. And I think we have more people in this movement than ever before, which is really what keeps me sort of motivated and hopeful. So yeah, I think just watch this space.
Yeah, and I go back to I remember when I settled on the name mindbodygreen, and this is 2008, people would say, why mindbodygreen? I don't get it. And I think now it's just so clear. Everyone understands the connection to nature. And to your point, look, people are always self-serving. And when you talk about mental health benefits, longevity benefits, when you're talking about cardiovascular health, nature is just so compelling to anyone who's just focused on themselves. Even in terms of, you made this great point earlier. I hate saying that, you don't like saying that nature is part of our toolkit because it kind of belittles nature. I get that, but it's part of our toolkit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of my real hopes for the book is that folks do sort of start to think about incorporating nature time into their wellness routine as a real, cornerstone that is just as important as, eating healthily and exercising. But yeah, I always encourage people to take it one step further and then consider, okay, nature has given me all of this stress reduction, and it's sort of helped me reframe my day and find all this good stuff. What am I doing in return? How am I reciprocating that? So yeah, every chapter of the book ends with actions that people can take to sort of protect that landscape they just explored moving forward. So that's definitely very important to me.
Yeah, and to build off of that, let's say we're doing all the right things and we've achieved optimal health, but our planet is in complete disarray. Does it really matter if, our homes are burning, or, we keep on experiencing these extreme weather events that are wreaking havoc on our communities? Like, how much does it really matter if we're in great health, if our surroundings are, completely disruptive and people are losing their lives? It's, to your point, it's important to get it. You got to take care of yourself. Can't take care of anyone else. We can't take care of you, but you got to think about the bigger picture.
Totally. And I would even add to that, like, I think that it's impossible to be totally healthy if our planet is ill. Every time we emit pollutants, it comes right back in our air. And it's what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. So
I'm not a huge fan of Prince Charles, but he's got this great quote around the air we breathe, the water we take, and that that is directly related to how we take care of our planet. So, Emma, thank you so much. Return to Nature is the book. Congratulations. Love it. And thank you so much for all the incredible work you do. And 7 years. Wow.
well, thank you, Jason. It was fun. It was fun to chat with you. I'm so happy you enjoyed the book.